I was fired for being pregnant by a manager who called me a liability, but she had no idea. My husband was a top employment lawyer, and he was about to destroy her whole career. The folder hit the table before Vanessa said a single word. She slid it across the glass like it was a gift, and I remember thinking, absurdly, that the folder was the wrong shade of blue for our brand guidelines. My hands were flat on my thighs so nobody would see them shaking. Written warning, she said. 30-day performance plan. Gareth Holloway sat beside her with his laptop open, typing nothing, just typing to look busy. He had a habit of clicking his pen cap when he was uncomfortable, and he was clicking it now, fast, like a countdown. Severe decline in productivity, Vanessa read from the page without looking up. A pattern of insubordination. Missed deadlines on 3 of your last 5 deliverables. I haven't missed a deadline in 3 years, I said. Name one. She didn't. She looked at Gareth instead, and Gareth looked at his screen, and for a second, the only sound in that glass conference room was his pen cap clicking against his knuckle. This isn't personal, Claire, Vanessa said. It's about the team's bandwidth, about what the account needs right now. I was 12 weeks and 4 days pregnant. I had told her exactly 9 days earlier, sitting in that same chair, smiling, ready to talk about coverage during my leave. She hadn't said congratulations. She'd looked at my stomach the way you'd look at a crack in a windshield, something that was going to spread whether you wanted it to or not, and asked how long I'd be gone. I signed nothing that day. I took the folder home, and I put it on the kitchen counter, and I called my husband before I'd even taken off my coat. Nathan didn't yell. Nathan doesn't yell. He got quiet in that particular way he gets quiet before a deposition, and he asked me one question. Did she say anything about the pregnancy? Out loud? In front of anyone? I told him no, not yet. Just the look and the question about my leave, and now this folder full of lies. Then we wait for her to say it, he said. She will. People like her always do. Document everything. Every email, every comment, every sideways remark. Don't quit. Whatever happens in that office, do not quit. I didn't understand yet what he meant by wait for her to say it. I understand it completely now, because it's the reason Vanessa Kessler doesn't work in marketing anymore, and it's the reason I'm typing this out at 11 at night with my daughter asleep down the hall. 3 years earlier, none of this would have seemed possible. I was 29 when I started at Bellhaven Creative, a mid-sized branding agency on the 6th floor of a converted warehouse in Denver's Rhino district. All exposed brick and standing desks, and an espresso machine nobody knew how to descale. I was hired as a marketing coordinator, making $61,000 a year, and within 18 months, I was a senior account manager making $78,000, running the agency's 2 biggest accounts, a regional grocery chain called Averill Foods and a boutique outdoor gear company called Northline. Vanessa hired me. She was 36 then, sharp-jawed and always the best-dressed person in any room. And for the first 2 years, she was, genuinely, the best manager I'd ever had. She pushed me hard, but she pushed fair. She took me to client dinners and let me lead the pitch. I remember one in particular, my second month on the job, when Averill Foods regional VP asked a hard question about a rebrand timeline, and Vanessa, instead of jumping in to save me, sat back and let me answer it, and afterward, in the parking lot, told me I'd handled it better than she would have at my age. That was the kind of manager she was in those years. She didn't hoard credit. She built it into other people, deliberately, like she understood that a strong second-in-command made her look stronger, not weaker. She called me her right hand. Once, at a company holiday party, she stood up during the toast and said Claire Whitfield was the reason Averill Foods hadn't walked, and I remember how good that felt, being named like that in a room full of people who mattered. She texted me on my birthday. She remembered that my father had had a heart scare the winter of my second year and asked about him for months afterward, unprompted. When I think about how easy it would be to tell this story as though Vanessa Kessler was always cold and calculating, some cartoon of a bad boss, I have to stop myself because it flattens something I think is actually more important. She was a person people liked working for. That was the whole mechanism. Nobody builds 3 careers worth of quiet damage by being obviously cruel. You build it by being wonderful right up until the moment it costs you something, and then discovering, apparently, that you're willing to pay that cost with somebody else's life instead of your own. I want to be honest about that because the version of this story where Vanessa was a monster from day one isn't true, and I think the truth matters more than the satisfaction of a clean villain. She was good to me until she wasn't, and the turn wasn't as sudden as it felt in that glass conference room. Looking back, I can see the hinge point now, a full year before I ever got pregnant. Her name was Sophia Bianchi, and she sat 2 desks down from me. Sophia was a senior copywriter, 31 years old, married to a firefighter named Dean, and in the spring of the year before I conceived, Sophia announced she was pregnant with twins. I remember the exact week because it was the same week we launched the Northline Spring campaign, and Sophia had written half the copy herself. Within 6 weeks, Sophia's biggest account got quietly reassigned to a junior writer for continuity. Within 10 weeks, Sophia was pulled off the leadership rotation she'd been on track for. Within 4 months, Sophia resigned for personal reasons, and Vanessa told the team at a Monday stand-up that Sophia had decided to focus on her family, and said it with a small, satisfied smile that I didn't think anything of at the time. I brought Sophia coffee once, a few weeks before she left, and we sat in the stairwell because it was the only place in that building with no glass walls. She told me very quietly that Vanessa had stopped inviting her to client calls because clients like consistency pregnancy, and that her mid-year review had criticized her for being distracted, a word that appeared nowhere in her review the year before, when she'd been the top-rated writer in the department. Sophia was one of the sharpest writers I'd ever worked with. She could turn a mediocre creative brief into something that made a client cry in a pitch meeting, and I'd watched her do it twice. I told her the distracted note was ridiculous. I told her to fight it, to go over Vanessa's head, to talk to Marcus directly. She looked at me like I was a child who didn't understand how the world actually worked, and in a way, I was. "Claire, I have 2 babies coming," she said. "I don't have the bandwidth to fight my own manager, too. I need this to be easy. I need it to just be over." She said it flatly, without self-pity, like she'd already run the numbers on the fight and decided she couldn't afford to have it, not the way the rest of us could afford to have it, not with a double stroller and a mortgage and 11 weeks of unpaid leave staring her down. I didn't connect it to anything at the time. I told myself Sophia's situation was different, that maybe there had been real performance issues nobody talked about, that Vanessa wouldn't do something so nakedly cruel to someone who'd given the agency 4 good years. I want to be honest that I told myself that. It was easier than the alternative. There was a third name too, one I only learned the full shape of much later, though I'd heard fragments of it even back then. A graphic designer named Renata Cole had left Bellhaven 8 months before I was ever hired, and the story that circulated about her, second-hand, third-hand, softened by time, was that she'd simply decided agency life wasn't for her after she got married, that she'd wanted a slower pace. Nobody ever said the word pregnancy in connection with Renata's name while I worked there. I didn't even know, at the time, that there was a connection to know. The alternative, the one I couldn't see yet, was that I was working for a woman who had done this before, more than once, and gotten away with it clean both times, and learned exactly how to do it again a little more efficiently with each pass. Nathan and I started trying in February, the year I turned 31. Nothing happened for 6 months, which our doctor told us wasn't unusual, but which felt at the time like a slow and private grief we carried into every ordinary Tuesday. By August, we'd started IUI, a process that involves a lot of early morning clinic appointments and a lot of pretending, at your desk by 9, that you haven't just spent 40 minutes in a waiting room full of other hopeful, exhausted people. I got good at pretending. I had to be. Working for a manager who tracked bandwidth the way other people tracked weather. I got pregnant in October, after 8 months of trying and 1 round of IUI that didn't take, and a second one that finally did. I told exactly 2 people before I told Vanessa, my sister, and my closest work friend, a strategist named Priya Anand, over margaritas at a happy hour in August, back when I was still just hoping, before either round had worked. We were at a bar 2 blocks from the office, and I remember the specific booth sticky with spilled salt from someone else's margarita rim, and Priya squeezing my hand under the table when I told her. I told Priya we were doing fertility treatments, that it might take a while, that I was nervous and excited and trying not to get my hopes up every single month. I asked her twice not to tell anyone. She promised, and I believed her, and I still believe, all these months later, that she kept that promise completely. What I didn't account for was the bar itself, half full of people from 3 different floors of our building, or the particular acoustics of an open room with hard floors and low ceilings, where a quiet conversation 2 booths over can travel further than either person at the table realizes. I didn't think anything of that conversation again until much later, when it turned out to matter more than almost anything else in this entire story. I found out I was pregnant on a Tuesday in early October, and I did exactly what every fertility website tells you to do. I waited. I didn't tell my boss. I didn't tell HR. I didn't tell anyone at the office except Priya, who already half knew. I waited until I'd cleared the 12-week mark, until the risk of losing it dropped enough that I could breathe again. And then, on a Thursday in late December, I sat down across from Vanessa Kessler and told her I was pregnant, and asked to talk through coverage for my leave. She didn't say congratulations. She asked how long I'd be gone. 12 weeks, I told her. Standard leave, per the handbook. She sighed. Not a small sigh. A long, theatrical exhale, the kind you give when someone's told you they've wrecked your car. Okay, she said. We'll figure it out. Then she picked her phone back up, and that was it. That was the whole conversation. 9 days later, I was sitting in a glass conference room while a man clicked a pen cap and Vanessa slid me a folder full of lies. I didn't know yet that the folder wasn't really about deadlines. I didn't know yet that it was the opening move in something Vanessa had done once before and had apparently decided was worth doing again. I only knew that something had gone cold in my manager's face the moment I told her I was having a baby, and that the coldness hadn't lifted since. The next 30 days were the longest of my professional life, and they came in stages, each one worse than the last, each one dressed up as something reasonable. Stage 1 started the Monday after the folder. My reports came back covered in red ink over nothing, a font size half a point off brand guidelines, a blue that was, in Vanessa's words, closer to periwinkle than our periwinkle, a note that took her 4 separate comment bubbles to explain on a document that hadn't needed a single revision 3 weeks earlier. She left me off the Avril Foods weekly email chain, the account I had personally saved 18 months earlier, the one I'd once talked back from the brink of walking during a tense call with their regional VP, and then, in front of 6 people in the Tuesday stand-up, asked me why I hadn't sent the weekly Avril update. I wasn't copied on the thread, I said. That's not an excuse, Claire, she said, and I watched 2 of my coworkers look down at their laptops, the universal gesture of people who don't want to be seen watching something ugly happen. Dominic, sitting across the table actually opened his mouth like he was going to say something, then closed it again. Later, he'd tell me he'd checked his own inbox in that exact moment and confirmed silently that I genuinely wasn't on the thread and had wanted to say so out loud and hadn't, and had felt sick about it for the rest of the day. I did what Nathan told me to do. I documented it. I forwarded myself a copy of every redline document, screenshotting the timestamp on each one before saving it to a folder on my personal laptop labeled with grim practicality, work, just in case. I sent Vanessa a polite follow-up after the stand-up just to confirm, could you re-add me to the Averill thread, and blind copied my personal email, so there would be a timestamp that existed outside the company's servers, immune to anyone quietly editing a record after the fact. She re-added me 40 minutes later with no reply, no acknowledgement, just my name appearing back on the chain like nothing had happened at all. Stage 2 came 8 days later when Vanessa reassigned the Averill Foods account to Dominic Reyes, temporarily, to balance workload during your transition. I asked calmly what transition she meant, since I wasn't due for another 6 months and hadn't asked to be moved off anything. She told me she was just being proactive, that she didn't want the client relationship to suffer if things changed suddenly. I asked her to define things. She said she didn't have time to get into it and had a call in 5 minutes, and stood up from her desk before I'd finished my sentence, which I understood even then to be its own kind of answer. I asked one more question before she reached the door. I asked if this reassignment was permanent, or if I'd get Averill back after my leave. She turned around halfway into the hallway and said, "Let's see how things go," in a tone that made it clear the sentence wasn't really an answer. It was a door closing very politely. Dominic, to his credit, came and found me at my desk that afternoon and told me, quietly, that he hadn't asked for the account and felt strange taking it. "I didn't push for this," he said. "I want you to know that. If it were up to me, I'd tell her to give it back." I told him it wasn't his fault. I meant it. I also, that night, wrote down exactly what he'd said and the date he'd said it, because Nathan had taught me, over 15 years of marriage to a man who spent his days building cases, that the smallest, most human details were usually the ones that mattered most in a room full of lawyers later. Dominic didn't know it yet, but he would end up being one of the people the independent investigator interviewed at length months later, and every word of what he told me at my desk that afternoon, he repeated, unprompted, under oath. Stage 3 was money. Vanessa called me in for what she framed as a check-in and told me almost gently that my year-end bonus was under review, given the productivity concerns, and that my raise conversation, originally scheduled for January, would need to be pushed until we see how the next few months go. I did the math in my head, sitting right there in her office, because I've always done math when I'm afraid it's steadier than feelings. My bonus the year before had been $4,200. My raise, if it followed the same trajectory as the last 2 years, would have been another $6,000 a year, guaranteed permanent, the kind of money that mattered enormously to a family about to go down to one income for 3 months. Nathan and I had already run our own numbers at the kitchen table, the way you do when a baby's coming, and that raise had a specific job in our budget. It was supposed to cover the difference between my disability pay and my actual paycheck. Without it, we were short by roughly $400 a month for at least a year. "You're penalizing me for being pregnant," I said, as calmly as I could manage. She looked genuinely wounded, the way people do when you name the thing they're doing and they'd rather not have it named. "That is not what this is about," she said. "This is about performance. I need you to hear that. I am trying to protect you here, Claire, more than you know." Then, almost as an afterthought, she added, "Other people on this team are watching how this gets handled too. It affects more than just you." I understood later exactly what she meant by that. She wasn't protecting me. She was rehearsing a defense out loud in real time in case anyone ever asked her to account for what she was doing, and I happened to be the only witness in the room. I have thought about that sentence more than almost anything else she said to me. I need you to hear that I am trying to protect you. I think, in some twisted corner of her own head, she believed it, the way people who cut corners on a bridge still believe, right up until it collapses, that they were simply being efficient. Stage 4 was the one that turned my stomach the most, because it wasn't really about me at all. Vanessa started telling other people on the team, in the loose, deniable way managers do, that I was checked out, that people needed to pick up the slack while I figured out my priorities. She never said pregnant. She never had to. Priya told me, upset, that Vanessa had said in a leadership meeting that my personal circumstances were creating real strain on team bandwidth, and that another manager, a soft-spoken creative director named Wendell Park, had actually pushed back and asked what circumstances she meant, and Vanessa had just smiled and said, you know, timing things, in a room full of people who all apparently knew exactly what she meant, and none of whom said another word about it. Priya told me all of this sitting in her car in the parking garage, one level down from mine, because she didn't trust the office anymore, not even the break room, not even the stairwell where Sophia and I used to sit. "I feel sick just repeating it," she said. "I don't know how she gets away with saying things like that and it just floating past everyone like nothing." Wendell looked uncomfortable for about 4 seconds and then went right back to his notes. I told her I didn't know either. I told her I was grateful, more than I could really say out loud without crying, that she'd been the one to push back at all, even quietly, even for 4 seconds. There was a 5th stage too, one that came almost a week after the account reassignment and just before the final, fatal check-in. Vanessa called me into her office on a Wednesday and, with without any warning, started to cry. Not performatively, not loudly, but real, glassy-eyed tears. And she told me that this whole situation was taking a toll on her too, that she hadn't slept properly in weeks, that she felt caught in the middle between what corporate expected and what she personally wanted for me. She reached across the desk at one point and squeezed my hand and told me she needed me to understand that none of this was easy for her either. I sat there, 6 months pregnant, watching my manager cry about how hard it was to fabricate a performance plan against me, and I felt something close to vertigo, the specific disorientation of being asked to comfort the person actively harming you. I told her carefully that I appreciated her sharing that and that I hoped we could resolve things fairly. I said nothing that could be used against me later. I said nothing that gave her what she wanted, which I understood, even in the moment, was some kind of absolution, some sentence from me that would let her tell herself afterward that I'd released her from responsibility. I didn't give it to her. I went to my car afterward and sat with my hands on the wheel for 11 minutes before I could drive. I was polite in every meeting. I answered every accusation with facts and follow-up emails. I never raised my voice, never cried in front of anyone at the office after that day, though God knows I cried plenty in my car in that same parking garage on at least 4 separate afternoons, engine off, radio off, just sitting there until I felt steady enough to drive home and be a person for Nathan. Stage 5 happened on a Thursday, in week 3 of the 30-day plan, during what Vanessa called a routine check-in. My phone was in my blazer pocket, recording, because Colorado is a one-party consent state, and Nathan had told me, flatly, to record every single meeting from that point forward, whether Vanessa knew it or not. We sat down. She asked how the improvement areas were coming along. I told her I'd hit every deliverable on the plan, on time, with documentation. She was quiet for a second, and then she leaned forward across her desk, the way she used to when she was about to say something she considered a kindness. Marketing is fast-paced, Claire, she said. You know that better than anyone, and I say this because I care about you. Frankly, a new mother doesn't have the bandwidth this job requires. The late nights, the travel. I've seen it happen before, and I don't want to watch it happen to you. I nodded. I apologized. The way you apologize to someone holding something over your head, buying time, staying calm, staying employed for 6 more days so the record would be complete. Inside my blazer pocket, my phone quietly caught every single syllable of it. Time-stamped, clean, unmistakably her voice, unmistakably what she meant. I didn't tell her what I already knew. I didn't tell her that "I've seen it happen before" was the sentence that would end her career, because it meant, in 6 plain words, that this wasn't an isolated moment of bad judgment. It was a pattern. It was Sophia Bianchi's name sitting quietly underneath mine, waiting for someone to say it out loud. Quick pause from the story. If you enjoy these stories, consider taking a listen to our Spotify show, linked in the description, for early access to new stories in better audio quality. Now back to the video. I called Nathan from the parking garage that afternoon, and for the first time in 3 weeks, I heard something in his voice that wasn't just careful and lawyerly. It was quiet satisfaction, the sound of a man who had just watched an opponent make the exact mistake he'd been waiting for. "Send me the audio tonight," he said. "And Claire, I need you to think hard about anything Vanessa could have known about the IVF before you told her you were pregnant. Anything at all." I told him about Priya, about the margaritas in August, about how I'd told her, quietly, that Nathan and I were doing fertility treatment, that it might take months, that I didn't want anyone else to know yet. I told him I trusted Priya completely, that there was no way she'd said anything to Vanessa. "I don't think Priya told her," Nathan said. "I think somebody else did, and I think I know how to find out." What Nathan found, over the following week, working nights after his own caseload at the firm, wasn't something Vanessa ever expected anyone to see. It started small. He requested, through the company's outside counsel, a standard set of documents as part of what he framed, at first, as a routine pre-litigation inquiry: HR files, performance review history, internal communications referencing my name. Companies almost always hand over more than they need to in that first request, because refusing looks worse than complying. And Bellhaven's outside counsel, a woman named Diane Ferris at a firm downtown, clearly hadn't yet grasped how much rope she was giving him. Nathan explained it to me one night at the kitchen table, turning his coffee mug in slow circles the way he does when he's thinking out loud. "Most people who do something like this," he said, "don't think of themselves as building a record. They think of themselves as being organized. Vanessa strikes me as the kind of manager who keeps notes on everyone, out of habit, out of control, long before she ever needs those notes for anything sinister, which means somewhere there's a file. People like her can't help themselves. They write it down." He was right, though it took 9 days of sorting through spreadsheets, shared drives, and a badly organized SharePoint site that Bellhaven's IT department clearly hadn't updated its permission structure on since roughly 2019. Nathan found 3 different versions of my fabricated performance record, each one slightly different from the last, which on its own was almost enough to win the case, since a legitimate paper trail doesn't usually need 3 revisions to say the same thing. But the spreadsheet was the piece that changed everything. Buried in a shared drive folder labeled Team Planning 2024, in a spreadsheet nobody outside leadership was supposed to see, Nathan found a tab titled Bandwidth Notes. It was Vanessa's. Her name was on the file's metadata as the last editor, 5 separate times over 14 months. It was a list of every woman on her team of of childbearing age. 9 names. Next to each one, a column marked risk level. Next to Sofia Bianchi's name, dated 11 months before Sofia ever announced her pregnancy, the note read, "Watch, recently married, age 30, high risk within 12-18 mo." Next to my name, dated in August, the same week I'd told Priya about the fertility treatments over margaritas, the note read, "Flagged by redacted name, TTC per office chatter. Monitor closely, reduce dependency on before any announcement, reduce dependency on before any announcement." Vanessa had started building a case to sideline me a full 4 months before I even knew I was pregnant, based on nothing but overheard gossip about my fertility treatment, gossip that had traveled from a happy hour margarita conversation through some chain of coworkers I still don't fully know, and landed on a spreadsheet with a column labeled risk level. The redacted name turned out not to matter much in the end, because it wasn't Priya, and Nathan made clear from the start that he had no interest in dragging some low-level office gossip chain through discovery. What mattered was Vanessa's own handwriting, so to speak. What mattered was that this wasn't a manager caught off guard by one inconvenient pregnancy. This was a documented, repeated, premeditated system for identifying women likely to become mothers and quietly reducing their value to the company before they ever had the chance to ask for anything. Renata Cole's name was on that spreadsheet too, exactly where I'd half expected it and half dreaded finding it, in an early tab dated nearly 2 years before I was ever hired. Her row was the oldest one, and reading it felt like reading the very first draft of a system Vanessa would spend the next several years refining. Risk level, medium, newly engaged, reassess post-wedding. Next to it, 6 months later, a second note in a different shade. The kind of small stylistic shift that told Nathan Vanessa had come back to update it deliberately, not absent-mindedly. Elevated. Discussed starting a family at team lunch. Begin reducing client-facing exposure. Nathan found Renata through an old professional networking profile, cold called her on a Tuesday evening, and was honest with her from the first sentence about who he was and why he was calling. She was quiet on the line for a long moment, he told me, long enough that he thought the call had dropped. Then she started to cry, and didn't really stop for almost 20 minutes, because nobody had ever told her it wasn't just her, that she hadn't imagined the whole thing, that there had been a real, documented, dated reason her promising 3-year career at Belhaven had quietly evaporated the same year she got engaged. She told Nathan she'd spent years wondering what she'd done wrong, whether she'd been too distracted, too eager to talk about her wedding at the wrong moments, whether the whole thing had somehow been her fault for wanting an ordinary life alongside an ordinary career. She'd left the industry entirely. She worked in real estate now, and told Nathan, almost apologetically, that she still didn't fully trust an office with a marketing floor. I sat at my kitchen table reading the printed pages Nathan brought home, and I felt something shift in my chest that I still don't have a clean word for. It wasn't just anger. It was the specific, sick vertigo of realizing that a thing you lived through as an accident, a single bad manager having a single bad reaction, was actually a machine, built on purpose, tested and refined on other women before it was ever pointed at me. I thought about Sofia Bianchi telling me tiredly that she didn't have the bandwidth to fight her own manager. I thought about how I'd told myself her situation was different. It wasn't different. It was the same spreadsheet. I was just 3 rows further down. Day 30 came on a Tuesday in late January. Gareth Holloway called the meeting for 10 in the morning, and I already knew what it was because Nathan and I had spent the weekend before preparing for exactly this. I wore the same navy blazer I'd worn to the first meeting, the one with the phone pocket, and I walked into that glass conference room one more time. Gareth had a folder in front of him, thicker than the first one. He read from a script, the kind of script HR reps are handed by lawyers who've never met the person being fired. He talked about failure to meet the metrics outlined in the performance plan. He talked about wanting me to succeed elsewhere. He said the company valued me, which was a strange thing to say to someone he was actively firing. Then he slid a second folder across the table, a severance agreement, 1 month's pay, $6,500, in exchange for signing away my right to ever sue the company for anything, ever, ending that day. Gareth looked almost pleased with himself when he said it. He actually said, and I will never forget this as long as I live, that I could put it towards some baby clothes. I have baby clothes, I said. My daughter isn't due to arrive for another 6 months. I have plenty of time. Gareth blinked, unsure how to respond to that, and glanced sideways at Vanessa, who took over. We just want to move forward cleanly, Claire, Vanessa said. For everyone's sake. This gets messy if it drags on. It doesn't have to be messy. What would make it messy? I asked. I kept my voice level. I had practiced this exact question with Nathan the night before, sitting on our bed, running through every version of this conversation he could imagine. You know what I mean, she said, which was, I realized later, the closest she ever came in that room to admitting there was something to be messy about it all. Vanessa didn't say much more after that. She sat with her arms crossed, and when I didn't reach for the pen right away, she rolled her eyes, an actual eye roll, the kind you'd give a toddler refusing dinner, and said, "Nobody's going to take a case for someone who couldn't hit her deadlines, Claire. You should sign it. It's more than you'd get otherwise." More than I'd get otherwise, I repeated back to her quietly, mostly so the phone in my blazer pocket would catch it clean. "I'm trying to help you," she said. And there it was again. That word, help. The same word she'd used the day she cried in her office. The word she seemed to believe covered anything she did as long as she said it with enough conviction. I looked at both of them for a long moment. I thought about Sophia, sitting in a stairwell telling me she didn't have the bandwidth to fight her own manager. I thought about Renata Cole, a name I didn't even know yet that morning, whose spreadsheet row was already sitting on a server somewhere, waiting to be found. I thought about the $6,500 and the $340,000 I didn't yet know was coming, and how little either number actually mattered next to the plain fact of being believed. I won't be signing anything, I said. My attorney will be in touch. Vanessa actually laughed, a short, disbelieving laugh, the kind you give when you think someone's bluffing badly. Your attorney, she repeated, like the word itself was a punchline. My husband, I said. Nathan Whitfield. He's a partner at QuokkaReads, employment law. You can look him up. I watched something flicker behind her eyes, the first real crack I'd seen in 3 weeks. A half-second of genuine calculation replacing the practiced condescension, but it closed again almost immediately, replaced by the same brittle confidence she'd worn through the whole 30 days. That's fine, she said too quickly. That's completely fine. Gareth wasn't quite as steady. His pen cap stopped clicking entirely. He looked down at the folder in front of him like it had suddenly gotten heavier. I stood up. I thanked them both for their time, which I meant with a kind of cold, deliberate irony they didn't catch, and I walked out of that building for the last time, past the espresso machine nobody knew how to discal, past Priya's desk, where she looked up at me with an expression I can only describe as heartbreak, and out into a gray Denver January that felt somehow like the first clean air I'd breathed in a month. Nathan didn't call Gareth. He didn't waste a single phone call on a man who'd never had any real power in that building to begin with. Instead, 2 days after my termination, he drove downtown himself and hand-delivered a binder to Diane Ferris, Belhaven's outside counsel, thick enough that the receptionist, according to Nathan, actually said, "Oh," out loud when she lifted it off the counter. Inside that binder was everything. Every time-stamped email proving Vanessa's productivity claims were fabricated. The full spreadsheet, bandwidth notes, with my name, Sophia's name, and Renata's name highlighted in 3 different colors. A sworn statement from Renata Cole. A pregnancy discrimination claim under both federal and Colorado state law. A retaliation claim. A wrongful termination claim. And on the very last page, a certified transcript of a recording, time-stamped, unmistakable, of a marketing director telling a pregnant employee that a new mother didn't have the bandwidth the job required and that she'd seen it happen before. Diane Ferris, according to the associate who was in the room, read 3 pages, closed the binder without finishing it, and picked up her phone before Nathan had even made it back down to the parking garage. That evening, I was on our bed folding tiny onesies, the ridiculous soft yellow ones my mother had bought before we even knew the baby's sex, when my phone buzzed with a text from a number I didn't recognize. I read it once, and my hands started shaking so badly I dropped the phone onto the comforter and had to pick it up twice before the words made sense. The message was from Priya. Vanessa's in an emergency meeting with legal and the CEO right now. Gareth just walked past my desk white as a sheet. Something is happening. I sat very still on the edge of my bed, a stack of folded onesies beside me, and I felt, for the first time in a month, something that wasn't fear. Nathan came home an hour later and found me still sitting there. He didn't say much at first. He just sat down beside me, took one of the little yellow onesies out of the stack, turned it over in his hands like he was examining evidence, and set it back down gently. They're going to want to settle fast, he said. Companies like this always do, once they see the whole file. They'll try to control the story before it gets to a courtroom, or worse, before it gets to a reporter. He was right, but it wasn't fast in the way I expected. It took 11 more days, and in those 11 days, the whole architecture of Belhaven Creative began to come apart, not from the top down the way you'd expect, but sideways, in the way institutions actually fracture, through the people inside them choosing, one by one, which side of the truth they were willing to stand on. The first crack came from inside HR itself. Gareth Holloway, it turned out, wasn't quite the willing accomplice he'd played in that conference room. 3 days after the binder landed on Diane Ferris's desk, Gareth's attorney reached out to Nathan directly. Gareth wanted to talk. Not because he'd developed a conscience overnight, Nathan suspected, but because he'd realized, correctly, that Vanessa and the company were about to try to make him the fall guy for enforcing a plan he hadn't designed, and he wanted to get ahead of it. Gareth's statement, when it came, was damning in a way even the spreadsheet wasn't, because it came from someone inside the room. He confirmed that Vanessa had come to him in December, before I'd even finished my sentence announcing the pregnancy, and told him she wanted documentation started in case she needed to move quickly. He confirmed that the productivity claims in my written warning had been fabricated after the fact, backdated in the system to make it look like concerns had existed earlier than they had. He confirmed, in writing under oath, that this wasn't the first time. He'd processed Sophia Bianchi's exit 2 years earlier, and had, in his own words, assumed at the time it was standard, because Vanessa made it seem standard. The second crack came from the CEO's office, a man named Marcus Ostrander who had founded Belhaven 14 years earlier, and had, by every account I later heard, genuinely believed his company was a good place to work. Priya told me later that Marcus had called an all-hands meeting the day the binder arrived, not to address the situation directly, since legal hadn't cleared him to say anything specific yet, but to announce, tight-jawed, that Vanessa Kessler was on administrative leave effective immediately, and that an independent investigation into the marketing department's management practices was beginning that week. The third crack, the one that surprised me most, came from a woman named Elaine Ostrander-Fitch, Marcus's older sister and, unbeknownst to most of the staff, a silent partner who held 18% of the company and sat on its small internal board. Elaine had, it turned out, taken maternity leave herself 22 years earlier, before Belhaven existed, from a different agency entirely, an agency that had demoted her the week she returned and driven her out within a year. She had never fully let go of that. She'd built her own small real estate investment firm afterward, mostly, she told Marcus once, to prove to herself she didn't need anyone's permission to be taken seriously again. When she found out what had been happening on her own company's marketing floor, under a spreadsheet with a column literally titled Risk Level, she was, according to two separate people who were in that boardroom, the loudest voice in the room demanding Vanessa be terminated outright, not managed out quietly with a non-disclosure agreement and a soft landing, the way these things so often go. Priya heard, through the office grapevine, that somehow always outran official announcements, that Elaine had said one sentence that ended the debate entirely. If we protect her, we become the agency that did this. I won't have my name on that. Marcus, who had spent 14 years building Belhaven's reputation as a genuinely good place to work, apparently didn't need much convincing after that. He'd hired Vanessa personally 6 years earlier, and Priya said he looked, in the days after the binder arrived, like a man discovering a structural crack in a house he'd built with his own hands. Vanessa did not go quietly. In the days after her leave began, she called 2 of her former direct reports at home, including Priya, and tried, in Priya's words, to get everyone's story straight. She told Priya that the whole thing was a massive misunderstanding, that she'd always supported working mothers, and astonishingly that Priya owed her for 3 years of mentorship and shouldn't throw that away over one bad month. Priya recorded none of it, because Colorado's one-party consent laws require you to actually think to hit record, and Priya, understandably, was too shaken in the moment. But she wrote it all down within the hour, dated and detailed, and handed it, unprompted, to the independent investigator the following week. Vanessa also, in a move Nathan later described as the kind of overreach that turns a strong case into an unbeatable one, sent a long email to the entire marketing department, CCing Marcus directly, framing herself as the victim of a coordinated attack, and implying that I had manufactured a narrative out of normal performance management. She specifically named Sofia Bianchi in that email, calling the comparison to Sofia's departure reckless and false, which would have been a reasonably smart legal instinct if it hadn't also, in trying to distance herself from Sofia's case, made 3 separate factual claims about Sofia's performance that Sofia's own old performance reviews, pulled by the investigator within 48 hours, directly contradicted. Vanessa tried to reach me directly too, twice, despite Nathan's letter making explicit that all communication needed to go through counsel. The first was a text message, sent from her personal number at 10 at night that read simply, "Can we talk? I never wanted this to go this way." I showed it to Nathan without responding, and he forwarded it to Diane Ferris the next morning with a short note pointing out that his client would appreciate the company's outside counsel, reminding its former employee about the no-contact terms. The second attempt came a week later, an email to my personal address with the subject line, "Please, Claire," which I also didn't open beyond the preview line, because Nathan had told me, gently but firmly, that nothing good could come from reading it, and that whatever she needed to say to feel better about herself wasn't my responsibility to receive. That email was the moment, Nathan told me later, when he stopped worrying about how the case would go. There was one more complication that emerged during that stretch, one Nathan hadn't fully anticipated. Avril Foods' regional VP, the same man who'd once asked me a hard question about a rebrand timeline in my second month at Belhaven, had heard rumblings through the industry grapevine. Denver's marketing scene is smaller than people think, that something serious was happening inside the agency handling his company's account. He called Marcus directly, not to threaten anything, but to ask, plainly, whether Avril Foods needed to start looking for a new agency. Marcus, to his credit, didn't lie to him. He told him there was an internal investigation into a management issue, that it involved a departed employee, and that he'd keep him updated as things developed. Avril didn't leave, but the call itself, Priya told me, rattled the whole leadership floor in a way even the independent investigator hadn't managed to, because it made abstract legal risk suddenly concrete and financial, the exact language people in that building actually spoke. I want to be honest about something else, too, because this story isn't only about triumph, and I don't think it would be true to tell it that way. There was a night, about 2 weeks into all of this, when I sat on my bathroom floor at 11 at night, 7 months pregnant, and cried in a way I hadn't let myself cry the whole time it was happening. Not about the money, and not even really about Vanessa. I cried because I had loved that job. I had loved Belhaven. The version of it I'd believed in for 2.5 years. The version where Vanessa stood up at a holiday party and called me the reason a client hadn't walked. I mourned that version of her. The mentor I thought I'd had, even while I was building the case that would end her career. Because grief doesn't check your legal strategy before it shows up. You can be furiously, righteously certain you're doing the right thing and still miss the person you thought someone was. Nathan found me there and didn't try to talk me out of it. He just sat down on the bathroom tile next to me in his work clothes and let me cry until I was done. And then he made tea, badly, because my husband has never once successfully brewed a cup of tea in 15 years of marriage. And I laughed for the first time in weeks at how bad it tasted. And that, more than any legal victory, was the night I actually started to feel like myself again. There were logistical complications too, the unglamorous kind nobody puts in the highlight reel. Because I'd been terminated, my health insurance was set to lapse at the end of the month, 7 weeks before my due date, and Nathan spent 2 full days on the phone securing COBRA coverage, and then, separately, negotiating with Belhaven's counsel to have the company retroactively cover my premiums as part of the emerging settlement talks, since losing coverage that late in a pregnancy wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a genuine danger. My unemployment claim was initially denied because Belhaven's HR system still listed my termination as for cause, a clerical fossil of the fabricated performance plan that took another week and a formal letter from Nathan's firm to correct. I sat on hold with the state unemployment office for 45 minutes on 3 separate occasions that month, 7 months pregnant, listening to the same 8 bars of hold music loop over and over, and I remember thinking, absurdly, that if I ever met whoever composed that particular loop, I would have some very direct feedback for them. There was also the matter of my 401k vesting schedule, which Belhaven's HR system had frozen the day of my termination, and a dispute over $412 in unused expense reimbursements from a client trip to Colorado Springs that took 6 separate emails to resolve. None of it was dramatic. All of it was exhausting in the specific grinding way that bureaucracy is exhausting when you're also nauseated, swollen-ankled, and trying to build a nursery out of a spare room that still had moving boxes in it from 3 years earlier. Small things, draining things, the kind of grinding bureaucratic aftermath that never makes it into the version of the story people imagine, where you win and the world simply resets to 0 the moment the verdict, or the settlement, or the apology arrives. The settlement talks move fast once they move. Diane Ferris, to her credit, seemed to understand within the first week that Belhaven's best move was containment, not combat. Nathan didn't file a lawsuit outright, not yet. He sent a demand letter instead, laying out the full claim: discrimination, retaliation, wrongful termination, plus the emotional distress claims strengthened enormously by the recorded conversation and the bandwidth notes spreadsheet, and gave the company 30 days to respond before he'd file in federal court and, he made clear, seek to have the spreadsheet and Vanessa's pattern of conduct made part of the public record. That last threat did more work than almost anything else in the letter. Belhaven was a 14-year-old agency with a client roster built entirely on reputation. Avril Foods, Northline, a dozen smaller regional brands who cared deeply about optics. A public federal complaint detailing a literal spreadsheet ranking employees by pregnancy risk would have been catastrophic. The kind of story that gets picked up by local news and then national outlets within a week. The kind of story clients quietly walk away from without ever issuing a statement about why. We settled 19 days after Nathan delivered that first binder. $340,000, covering back pay, front pay, emotional distress damages, and my attorney's fees, which Nathan, in a small act of quiet stubbornness, insisted on itemizing separately, so the company couldn't later claim the settlement had been generous when most of it had simply been what the law already entitled me to. Belhaven also agreed, in writing, to a company-wide review of leave and promotion practices, overseen for 18 months by an outside compliance monitor, a condition Nathan pushed hard for, and that I think mattered to me more, in the end, than the money did. Vanessa was terminated, not managed out. Marcus Ostrander, to his credit, refused to let her resign quietly with a clean reference, the way these things so often end for people at her level. The quiet exits that let a person simply reappear at a new company 18 months later with a polished LinkedIn summary and no visible scar tissue. Her termination letter cited a documented pattern of discriminatory conduct, language that follows a person, that shows up when the next company calls for a reference, that makes the next 12 years of a career very different from the previous 12. Nathan told me, and I believed him, that this single detail mattered to me more in the months that followed than the settlement number ever did. Money solved a budget problem. The letter solved something else, something closer to being believed on paper, permanently, by an institution that had spent 30 days telling me I'd imagined the whole thing. Elaine Ostrander Fitch, I later heard, personally pushed the board to fund the 18-month compliance monitor out of the company's own reserves, rather than folding it into the settlement, specifically so it couldn't later be spun, in any future retelling, as something I had merely negotiated for myself rather than something the company had chosen, belatedly, to actually want. I heard secondhand through Priya that Vanessa spent months afterward telling anyone who'd listen that she'd been the victim of a lawyer husband with a vendetta, that the case had been blown wildly out of proportion, that she'd made one comment, taken out of context. I understand in a strange way why she needed to believe that. I don't think Vanessa Kessler ever thought of herself as a villain. I think she thought of herself as protecting a business, protecting a bottom line, doing the hard, unpopular work that someone had to do. I think that's how most people who do enormous harm actually experience themselves, not as monsters, but as pragmatists making difficult calls nobody else has the stomach for. It doesn't make what she did to Sophia, to Renata, to me, any less deliberate. It just means the truth of her was smaller and sadder than a villain, and somehow that was harder to sit with than fury would have been. My daughter, Josephine, was born on a Sunday morning in April, 6 weeks after the settlement, 7 pounds 2 ounces, with a full head of dark hair and lungs that Nathan swears he heard from the parking garage. Priya was the first person outside my family to visit, and she brought a onesie that said future CEO, which made both of us laugh harder than the joke probably deserved. The specific relieved laughter of two people who'd spent a winter bracing for something worse than what actually arrived. I think about that spreadsheet sometimes. Still, when I'm rocking Josephine at 3 in the morning, the house dark except for the small lamp in the nursery, we finally finished unpacking. Risk level, reduced dependency, on. A woman who had never met my daughter had tried to calculate, in a shared drive nobody was supposed to see, exactly how much I was worth before Josephine even existed, and had gotten the number catastrophically wrong, off by $340,000, and more importantly, off by every single thing that number couldn't actually measure. I went back to work 8 months after Josephine was born, but not to Belhaven, and not to another agency exactly like it. I took a job at a smaller branding studio across town, one with 4 women in leadership positions and a maternity policy that didn't require a lawyer to enforce it, and I make $83,000 a year now, $5,000 more than I would have made at Belhaven, even with the raise Vanessa held over my head. My new manager, a woman named Kathy Ibarra, asked me in my first week whether there was anything from my last job she should know about in case it came up with clients. I gave her the short version. She listened, nodded once, and said, "Well, you'll never get that here," and then moved on to the actual agenda for the meeting, which was, more than any grand gesture could have been, exactly the reassurance I needed. Priya left Belhaven 4 months after I did, unable, she told me, to sit at a desk 2 feet from where that spreadsheet had been built, to keep walking past Gareth's old office and Vanessa's old chair, now occupied by someone new who had no idea what had happened in it. She works with me now, 2 desks down, the same distance Sophia and I used to be from each other in a building neither of us works in anymore. We still get margaritas sometimes, though we're more careful, half-joking, about what we say out loud in public places, and Priya still, occasionally, apologizes for a conversation she had absolutely nothing to do with, and I still, every time, tell her to stop. Sophia Bianchi called me the week the settlement was finalized, out of nowhere, because Nathan's firm had reached out to her attorney about a possible claim of her own, since Colorado's statute of limitations still left her a narrow window. She cried on the phone, the same 20 minutes of relief Nathan had described from Renata, and then she thanked me, which felt strange to receive because I hadn't done any of it for her. I'd done it because I was drowning and my husband knew how to build a boat, but I understood what she meant. Somebody had finally said it out loud, in a room with lawyers and binders and consequences, that what happened to her wasn't in her head, wasn't bad luck, wasn't a coincidence of timing. She told me her twins were 18 months old now, that she'd found work doing freelance copywriting from home, that some days she missed the version of her career she'd been building before Belhaven, and some days she didn't miss it at all. Sophia settled her own claim 4 months later quietly, for an amount I never asked about and she never offered, and sent me a single text when it closed. We were right, that was all it said. I sat with my phone in my hand for a long time after reading it. I think about the thesis of all this more than I probably should, lying awake with Josephine on my chest at odd hours, turning the whole 30 days over like a stone I keep checking for new angles. Here is what I've landed on. The worst thing Vanessa Kessler did wasn't the folder, or the fabricated deadlines, or even the spreadsheet. It was the sentence she said with her arms crossed and her eyes rolled, the one she was so certain of that she never once considered it might be wrong. Nobody's going to take a case for someone who couldn't hit her deadlines. She believed all the way down that the system would protect her, that a pregnant woman with a paper trail full of lies would have no recourse, would sign the folder and take the $6,500 and disappear quietly into motherhood the way Sophia had, the way Renata had, the way the system usually counts on women disappearing. She had no idea who she was talking to. She had no idea that the man waiting for me in the parking garage, the one who made terrible tea and sat on bathroom tile at midnight without needing to be asked, had spent 15 years building exactly the kind of case that ends careers like hers. She had no idea that the ceiling she thought she'd built around me had a name and a law degree, and had been quietly, patiently documenting every single thing she said since the moment I told him her face went cold at the word pregnant. I don't feel triumphant, not exactly, when I tell this story now. I feel something quieter and more complicated than that. I lost 2.5 years of work I was genuinely proud of, work that built 2 of the biggest accounts in that agency's portfolio, work I don't get to put in a highlight reel because the company it was built for is one I can't bring myself to name on a resume without a paragraph of context nobody asks for. I lost a version of a mentor I'd believed in, and grieving that loss, even now, still catches me sideways sometimes, at odd hours, for no reason I can predict. A stranger's laugh in a coffee shop that sounds like hers, a navy blazer on a rack that reminds me of the one I wore to that first meeting. I lost the ability to ever fully trust a compliment from a manager again, without some small, watchful part of my brain checking it for the angle, quietly cataloging it just in case. Those are real losses, and no settlement check, however large, ever fully closes them. I don't think they're supposed to. I think that's just what it costs to see a thing clearly once you've been forced to see it clearly, and there's no unseeing it afterward, no matter how good the outcome turns out to be. But I gained something too, something I try to remember on the mornings Josephine wakes me at 5, and I'm too tired to feel anything as clean as triumph. I gained the knowledge that I didn't imagine it, that I wasn't difficult or dramatic or reading too much into a look, shock that the cold flicker across Vanessa's face the day I told her I was pregnant was exactly as real and as calculated as it felt. I gained a daughter who will grow up in a house where her mother didn't sign the folder. And somewhere in a filing cabinet downtown, there's a permanent, certified record that a company once built a spreadsheet to calculate exactly how disposable I was, and got it wrong, catastrophically, unforgivably wrong, in a way that followed the woman who built it for the rest of her career. Josephine is 14 months old now. She doesn't know any of this yet, and by the time she's old enough to understand it, I imagine it will feel to her the way old family stories always feel to kids, distant and slightly unreal, something that happened to a version of her mother she never actually met. Maybe I'll show her the spreadsheet someday, printed and yellowing in a folder in the garage, not to make her angry, but so she knows early that the people who are supposed to protect you sometimes don't, and that it isn't always your fault when they fail, and that there is almost always a way to keep going anyway. I was fired for being pregnant by a manager who called me a liability. She had no idea my husband was a top employment lawyer, and she never saw the ending coming, right up until the moment it arrived.